All right, so now let's talk about energy, how the body makes energy and how we get energy from food. All right, so remember, the purpose of eating real food is to give the body nutrients for structure, form, and function. And also we want to get energy from food, but we want to do it in a certain way so that we nurture self-sufficiency, metabolic flexibility, and fat burning. All right, so again, if we go back to our concept of nutritional vitality, this is how we assess foods to determine which ones are the optimal ones to consume and how we consume those foods. Now, something very important and beneficial to understand is that body fat is there for a reason. When I ask people, what is the purpose of stored body fat? I get all kinds of different answers. It's cushioning for organs in the body, which there's some truth to that. We do have some fat that cushions organs and joints and bones. And then we also get the response that, maybe body fat's there for warmth. And that's not the reason body fat is there. The reason that we have body fat, it's an evolutionary adaptation to starvation. Body fat is there as stored energy for periods of not eating. That's what it's there for. All right. The reason that we have fat is for energy for when we're not eating. So one of the things that we can do to get our body to use fat for fuel is to not eat all the time. One of our primary focuses with our way of eating is training the body how to use its own body fat for fuel. Why? Because we're mimicking the evolutionary template. It's much more efficient. It's less metabolically damaging than being a sugar burner. And it gives us all the things that we're looking for from a real food way of eating. Consistent energy levels, because we have this usable energy source that's just on us all the time, and it's almost indefinite for most of us. Even the leanest of us could probably go days and weeks without eating food because of the fat that we have on us. So it's a consistent, reliable energy source. It's less metabolically damaging. It gives us body composition changes. It allows us to go through periods of space and not eating, which is very healing for the body. So training the body how to use body fat is one of our primary goals. Now, this is a very important concept to understand too, very beneficial. Where does the body get energy from? What are the sources, the possible sources of energy? And when I ask this question, I get a lot of different responses as well. There's mainly two places we can get energy from, whether it's dietary or from the body. The first one is carbohydrates. All right, carbohydrates, now that we know our definition of real food, carbohydrates to us mean the sources of starch and sugar, like sweet potatoes and rice and yams and cassava and all of our safe starches, and then fruits. And then we could throw in things like honey and improved sweeteners and things like that, right? So these things get broken down into glucose. And glucose is something that every cell in the body can use, okay? So we can get energy from carbohydrates, or we can also get energy from fat. A lot of people don't know this. We can get energy from fat, right? Why do we have stored body fat? Because it's energy for when not eating. And so when we go through periods of not eating, the body can actually break down free fatty acids and use those things for energy. Now, we can get energy from carbs or fat. Is there anything else we can get energy from? Some people would say, well, can't we break down muscle and protein and create energy? Yes, we can. But when we do that through a process called gluconeogenesis, we turn it into glucose. So now we're back to carbohydrates, right? Some people would say, what about the keto movement and ketosis and using ketones? Well, ketones are created from fat and free fatty acids. So again, we're back to fat. So really, we have two options, carbs and fat. Now, something very important and beneficial to understand is that carbohydrates are the opposite of fat for fuel. So if I'm trying to get my body to learn how to use fat for fuel, then every time I have carbs, I'm doing the opposite of using fat for fuel. And by the way, we already know how to use carbohydrates for fuel. We have glucose running through our bloodstream all the time. Even if I go low carb keto for 10 years, if I measure my blood glucose, I have glucose. Why? Because my body's always making it. So I don't need to teach my body how to use glucose or sugar because it already knows how to use it. I need to teach my body how to use fat because that's how most people don't understand how to use fat for fuel, okay? So understanding that carbs are the opposite of fat for fuel, this helps us dictate some of our rules. And again, understanding that stored body fat is energy for when we're not eating, this is how we come up with what we call our ideal day's meals. So our ideal day's meals is our way of structuring our daily eating or structuring our macros. The first rule of the ideal day's meals is no carbs first part of the day. And why is that? Well, again, all of us understand very well how to use carbohydrates for fuel. Most of us don't understand how to use fat for fuel. And so if I have carbohydrates to start my day, even real food carbohydrates that we approve of, like a bowl of fruit or some honey, I am teaching my body not to use fat for fuel but reinforcing the signal of carbohydrates for fuel. And what I want to do is teach my body how to use fat for fuel. So when we wake up in the morning, most of us are fasted from 8 or 9 or 10 hours of sleep and being without food since dinner. And so our body is already trying to learn how to use fat for fuel because it doesn't have another option. Maybe there's a little bit of glucose it's getting from liver glycogen or something. But it's a perfect time to reinforce the signal of fat for fuel. So that first meal, we recommend being something protein-based and fat-based, and maybe some nutrient-dense vegetables. So you could do an omelet with vegetables, an omelet with some cheese, an omelet cooked in butter, by the way, or you could do eggs and bacon, eggs and sausage. You could do a steak and salad in the morning. You could do salmon and salad. I mean, it doesn't matter. Anything that fits the definition of no carbs first part of the day is going to be useful because we're giving the body nutrients to work with for the day, and we're also giving the body a signal of fat for fuel versus carbohydrates for fuel. Okay. The second rule of our ideal days meals is we don't snack in between our main meals. And why? Well, because we just mentioned stored body fat is energy for when we're not eating. And so we have to go through periods of not eating. This is healthy for us, okay? Because this is the time that our body is using fat for fuel. This is the time that the digestive system is healing and resting itself. This is the time that we can go internally and detoxify, okay? So, no snacking in between your main meals means you choose your number of meals and you're just not grazing all day. Most people start out with 3 meals in a day. A lot of people gravitate towards 2 meals a day. Some people do 1 meal a day over time. The number of meals isn't anywhere near as important as eating real food and making sure that you're not snacking and grazing all the time. All right. The final rule of the ideal days meals is have some carbohydrates later in the day. All right. Now, we're not low carbers. We're strategic carbers. Right? We don't believe in having carbs for the first part of the day because we're trying to get a fat burning training effect. And then when we have carbs, we just have a little bit of carbs later, measured out up to 3/4 of a cup of safe starches and 3/4 of a cup of fruit, ideally a half a cup of each from real food sources in these smaller amounts, timed later in the day. It's perfectly fine and appropriate. And we get the benefits of the nutrients that come from those carb sources. And we also have the sanity of having carbs and not having to call ourselves low carb or ketogenic or anything like that, okay? So again, we talked about it before, that carbohydrate plate needs to be smaller because carbohydrates are the problem for most people. And that means that we want to make sure that we get carbohydrates from real food sources in small amounts and that we time that later in the day. Now again, most people, based on these ideal days meals rules, are going to choose 3 meals in a day starting out, and that means no carbs for breakfast, no carbs for lunch, and then a little bit of carbs in the evening with your dinner, and then maybe some fruit for dessert or something like that. Over time, a lot of people start to get so nutritionally sufficient and train their body how to use fat for fuel, appetite completely changes. And they don't feel like eating breakfast, or they don't feel like eating as often. And so a lot of people will gravitate towards 2 meals a day naturally. If that happens for you, it's perfectly fine. It's not something you need to strive for necessarily. And some people can go to 1 meal a day over time. But the bottom line is choose your number of meals, no carbs first part of the day, no snacking in between your main meals, and then when you have carbohydrates, it's later in the day from real food sources in moderated amounts. All right? So again, our way of eating, we're eating for nutrients to give the body what it needs to build the body and contribute to structure, form, and function, and we're also eating in a way that trains the body how to use fat for fuel, ideally excess body fat for fuel, and we just have to have some rules around our carbohydrates. And if we can step back big picture and think about what it is we're trying to do, we're trying to eat real food, all right? According to our definition, we have to be strategic with our carbohydrates because that's where the problem is for most of us. And we need to allow space in periods of not eating because that's where the magic of fat burning happens, and that's where a lot of health benefits come from.